Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of my YouTube channel. For this episode, we will be covering what might be probably the worst fraud scandal I've come across in this country in a very long time. This is, of course, the Somali Fraud Scandal in the state of Minnesota, wherein it has been uncovered that at least $1 billion in federal funds sent to Minnesota since 2018, potentially $9 billion, has been stolen through coordinated fraud schemes predominantly operated within the Somali immigrant community. Utterly insane stuff. Yet, as scandalous as this isn't some random, insignificant fraud scheme. This is a microcosm of a much bigger problem that has gripped the state of Minnesota and our country at large. I think what has unfolded in Minnesota over the past decade represents one of the most catastrophic failures, blatant failures of our immigration policy. So we will be discussing the fraud schemes under question, the impact it's had on Minnesotans and our country, and ultimately the implications. And finally, what should be the appropriate response from the government in response to this fraud. We will be discussing all of this in a moment. Thanks for joining me. So there are three major fraud schemes under question. We're going to walk you through the anatomy of each of them and then delve into their implications. The first is the Feeding Our Future scheme, worth approximately $250 million. The Feeding Our Future scandal sort of serves as the foundational blueprint for what would become a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. Beginning as a modest nonprofit, the organization would go on to steal COVID emergency funds from the Child Nutrition Program, which was designed to feed starving children. That's right, so you had a program designed to feed kids who were hungry, and the fraudsters went ahead and stole those funds. An astonishing $250 million was siphoned by these fraudsters. It's so bad that investigators have called it the largest pandemic fraud scheme in the United States. The mechanics were brutally simple. They would create these shell companies, recruit accomplices to pose as site sponsors, fabricate beneficiary lists, and then submit fake invoices for exponentially increasing number of meals that were never served to children. The proceeds were then used to enrich the fraudsters through luxury cars, lakefront properties, and fancy international trips. The scale of this fraud was made possible by a critical strategic move. So when state officials initially questioned these suspicious claims, the organization sued them back in 2020 for racial discrimination, weaponizing identity politics to intimidate regulators into compliance. The second scandal is the housing and autism services fraud under Medicaid. As if scamming innocent children of meals wasn't sufficient, the criminals identified new veins to mine within Minnesota's generous welfare system. Two Medicaid programs, the Housing Stabilization Services for seniors and disabled adults, and the Autism Therapy Services for children, became the next targets. The housing program, initially budgeted at approximately $2.6 million, exploded to over $100 million in cost, as fraudsters perfected what is known as fraud tourism, wherein they would recruit individuals from other states to travel to Minnesota, secure addresses, and enroll in the program. Sham companies were billed for services never rendered, with some providers submitting claims for 24 hours of care in a single day. The autism program followed a similar pattern, wherein unqualified providers offered kickbacks to parents who enroll their children, then billed Medicaid for therapy never delivered. Despite the suspicions, all of this happened under the radar. Why? Because instead of seeking the welfare of their citizens, Minnesotan politicians were more concerned about being called names like racist by the Somali community. I want you to process that for a second. This is the sad reality of the civil rights society that we live in today. That you can see something clearly wrong, clearly egregious, but you can't call it out if it's being perpetrated by a supposed victim minority group because you might be called bad names. That's the state of the country we're living in today. Now, the final frontier, the final fraud scandal, which has captured the airwaves in recent months, is the daycare fraud. You've seen the memes online. That speaks to just how morally bankrupt it is. This particular fraud centers around the state's child care assistance program, where investigations and most importantly, a viral video expose by journalist Nick Shirley showed taxpayer-funded daycare centers standing empty during operating hours with no children in these supposed daycare centers. Nick Shirley would just walk up to these daycares during the day, and there is literally not a single soul in these centers. The scheme followed the same pattern as before: register daycare businesses, enroll phantom children, collect state subsidies, and profit off of it. The FBI has identified this as just the tip of a very large iceberg, with Minnesota's lax oversight allowing the fraud to metastasize until it threatened the entire program's viability. The federal government has frozen millions in child care funds to Minnesota in response, which, to be honest, while it is a good move, it's just laughable that it's just now that they have finally decided to act. Clearly egregious stuff happening, utterly bunkers. Now, the lingering question here is why and how? Right? How could fraud of that proportion happen? And of all places, Minnesota, a place that is known for having a high level of social trust, right? Traditionally, it's been a very homogenous society. And the answer is simple: it's demographics. It was not a random group of people who perpetrated those fraud schemes. We know, as the evidence shows, that this was orchestrated predominantly, overwhelmingly, by members of the Somali community. Of the 92 individuals that have been charged across these interconnected schemes, I think approximately 90% of them identify as Somali. So it's abundantly clear who the perpetrators are, contrary to what the mainstream media would have you believe. The sophistication of the schemes require trust and coordination among co-conspirators, shared language, and community ties to evade detection, and knowledge of specific vulnerabilities in the welfare system. These conditions are perfectly met within the Somali immigrant enclaves of Minneapolis, which is very insulated from the rest of sort of Minnesotan society. One of the reasons why the scandal is so important, and it isn't just limited to Minnesota, is because I think the scandal has revealed a systematic dependency that is very characteristic of many of the people we have imported into the United States. The fraud schemes did not emerge from a vacuum, but from a community exhibiting some of the most extreme welfare dependency ever documented among immigrant populations in the United States. Data from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey paints a very devastating portrait. 89% of Somali households with children receive some form of public assistance, compared to approximately 25% of native-born households nationally. 73% are enrolled in Medicaid, the government health insurance program for low-income individuals. 54% receive food stamps, triple the national average. 52% of children in Somali immigrant homes live below the poverty line, compared to just 8% in native-headed households. And perhaps most tellingly, 1 in every 8 children living in poverty in Minnesota today comes from the Somali household, despite Somalis representing only about 1% of the state's total population. These numbers represent more than temporary hardship. They document the creation of a permanent underclass that contributes minimally to the tax base while consuming disproportionately from the public treasury. Furthermore, the Somali immigrant community in America suffers from some of the worst human capital deficits. Right? After more than 10 years in the United States, half of working-age Somalis still cannot speak English very well, severely limiting employment prospects and fostering isolation. 39% lack a high school diploma, compared to 10% of native-born Americans. Labor force participation rates for Somali men trail national averages by approximately 20 percentage points, with even wider gaps for women. It's like, what did we think would be the result of importing mass numbers of people from a failed Islamic state with one of the world's lowest literacy rates and no tradition of formal education? But like much of our ruling class, Somali's political establishment, which was committed to the fiction that all cultures are equal, ignored these fundamental realities when advocating for mass Somali resettlement in the state. So, all things being equal, it is abundantly clear that this is a community that is not integrated into the American way of life. This narrative of successful Somali integration, promoted by politicians and refugee advocacy organizations alike, collapses under the most cursory scrutiny. While a small professional class has emerged, and some have achieved political office, I should note, the community overall ranks at or near the bottom of virtually every socioeconomic indicator among immigrant groups in Minnesota. The much celebrated entrepreneurship often consists of businesses catering exclusively to the Somali community and frequently dependent on government contracts or subsidy programs themselves. And also many of them are fraudulent, as we just discussed. So how exactly does this benefit the people of Minnesota? And the answer is it doesn't. To make matters worse, these people normally live in ethnic enclaves in Minnesota, thus further insulating them from broader American society, and further fostering the preservation of cultural practices incompatible with Western legal and economic systems, including the clan-based loyalty structures, something that supersedes civic responsibility like we know here in the West, and a documented skepticism of governmental institutions carried over from experiences in Somalia's anarchic failed state. So ultimately, what we have here in Minnesota is a clash of systems, right? A cultural disconnect, which is very representative of much of the predicament of our immigration system today in this country. On the one hand, you've got a modern Western welfare state, like Minnesota, and on the other hand, a traditional Somali clan-based sort of social polity. The welfare state is supposed to operate on principles of universal rules, impartial administration, and trust in bureaucratic processes. Somali society, developed in a context of statelessness and constant conflict, operates on clan loyalty, personal networks, and a deep skepticism of formal institutions. This cultural disconnect manifests in concrete ways, where Minnesota's system assumes applicants will provide truthful information. Somali cultural experience teaches that institutions are to be manipulated for clan or family advantage. Where Western systems value individual achievement, Somali tradition emphasizes resource distribution within extended kinship networks. The concept of the public funds as a shared trust to be used according to established rules simply doesn't translate from a context where resources are obtained through clan competition and redistribution like you have in Somalia. At the end of the day, this is simply a reflection of the failed state culture of Somalia. Somalia has not had a functional central government for most of the past 3 decades. In this environment, survival depends on exploiting whatever resources become available through whatever means necessary. The concept of the government as a legitimate authority representing the people simply doesn't exist in the Somali consciousness. That's just a fact. It is either an enemy force, an irrelevant entity, or a resource to be plundered. Importing tens of thousands of people from this environment directly into America's most generous welfare systems was an experiment in social engineering that ignored basic human psychology and cultural conditioning. This background explains the brazenness of the fraud schemes, the luxury cars purchased from the stolen funds, the lakefront properties, the international travel, right? Stealing funds meant to help starving kids. In a failed state context, displaying wealth is a survival strategy that signals power and deters challengers. The criminals weren't hiding their proceeds. They were following cultural scripts that value conspicuous consumption as a demonstration of successful resource extraction. One of the most fascinating aspects of this scandal has been witnessing the reactions of people. Now the light is being shed, the usual weaponization of victimhood playbook has been evoked. Any scrutiny of criminal activity within the community is immediately met with accusations of racism and Islamophobia, whatever those words mean. When the Feeding Our Future scheme was first questioned by state officials, the organization didn't address the discrepancies. It sued for racial discrimination. This pattern has repeated constantly. Legitimate law enforcement is framed as persecution. Fraud investigations become targeting of the Muslim community, and calls for accountability are dismissed as bigotry. This tactic has been devastatingly effective because it exploits the guilt and ideological commitments of Minnesota's progressive political establishment. Regulators, prosecutors, and politicians fear being labeled racist more than they fear the consequences of wasted billions, creating a kind of perverse incentive structure where the more brazen the fraud, the more aggressively its perpetrators can claim victim status. Now, while the perpetrators are obviously culpable, it is hard to escape the fact that the political class of Minnesota, comprised overwhelmingly of Democrats, has been just as complicit in the scam. Governor Tim Walz's administration has consistently downplayed the fraud scale, viciously attacked whistleblowers, state employees and prioritized political optics instead of actually going after the fraudsters and recovering the stolen funds. When federal prosecutors revealed the billions that were stolen, Waltz dismissed it as a number pulled out of thin air, rather than confronting the systematic failure that occurred under his watch. Rather than viciously going after asset forfeiture and restitution from convicted fraudsters, the Attorney General has instead focused his energy on threatening legal action against the federal government for freezing funds to Minnesota, essentially demanding that these funds continue to flow into this now exposed corrupt system that is being operated in Minnesota. This political cowardice stems from three sources: genuine ideological commitment to open borders and the stupid excuse of marginalized communities as some kind of justification for the egregious scale of fraud we've witnessed. And then secondly, fear of being labeled racist by the activist class, and the most obvious one, the view of the Somali community as a reliable voting bloc. At the end of the day, as they say, demographics is destiny. The result has been the transformation of Minnesota's government from, a steward of public resources to accomplice in their dissipation. That, sadly, is the reality of the situation on the ground. Now, as complicit as Minnesotan political officials are in this fraud, it's important to remember that it doesn't stop with Minnesota, all right? It goes back to Washington, where bipartisan refugee policies created the conditions for this disaster to occur. The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, operating under the logic of humanitarian imperative, resettled approximately 150,000 Somali refugees between 1990 and 2020, with Minnesota receiving a disproportionate share due to its existing welfare infrastructure and cold weather, believed to discourage secondary migration. These policies were implemented without any serious cost-benefit analysis, without consideration of assimilation capacity, and without acknowledgement of the cultural chasm between Somali society and American society. The resettlement agencies, often religious organizations with funding tied to the number of refugees placed, had every incentive to maximize the arrivals and none to report problems or failures of integration. Even as evidence of systematic fraud mounted, the federal response has been tepid and conflicted. While the Department of Justice has prosecuted individual cases, there really hasn't been any kind of full-on systematic effort to ensure this does not continue happening. The Department of Health and Human Services, as we mentioned earlier, froze some payments to Minnesotans only after the fraud became too conspicuous to ignore, but has shown very little appetite for fundamental reforms needed to prevent similar exploitation in other states with large welfare dependent populations. So it's abundantly clear the federal government also bears a share of the responsibility of what has transpired in Minnesota. Another potential consequence of the scandal, which highlights the utmost importance of dealing with it, is the spread to other jurisdictions across the country. Investigators have already identified connections to fraud networks in places like Ohio, Washington, and Oregon, where similar Somali communities have begun replicating the schemes perfected in Minneapolis. The fraud tourism model we mentioned earlier, where individuals travel between states to maximize benefits and exploit different programs, represents a new frontier in welfare exploitation that state-based enforcement systems are ill-equipped to combat. In Washington state, for example, where Somali immigrants constitute a smaller but growing population, Somali-owned businesses have come under immense scrutiny from communities. I mean, why wouldn't they, after what has transpired in Minnesota? Totally reasonable. And this is another consequence of this fraud scandal that's underlooked, which is the decline, the erosion of social trust within American communities. Now, the fraud has occurred, right? Billions of dollars in taxpayer funds have been siphoned, and much of that amount most likely will not be recovered. So what should be the response of the federal government and Minnesota to this problem? Here are some measures I recommend. These measures may be denounced as draconian, but they are absolutely necessary if we want to restore fiscal integrity and social trust of not just Minnesota, but our country as a whole. Number one, we need mass deportation of the fraud participants. Every Somali convicted of welfare fraud must face immediate deportation proceedings. The Department of Homeland Security ought to exercise its authority under federal immigration law to remove these people. Naturalized citizens who partook in these fraud scandals ought to be convicted, prosecuted, and deported. Simple as that. Number two, we need a complete overhaul of the refugee resettlement program. Okay? This is the program that has brought in mass amounts of people into our country who do not share our values, who do not share our culture, who despise us. Okay? We no longer should be importing people from third world countries. We're done. Okay, we've already brought upon ourselves enough calamity. Any future resettlement must include rigorous assessment of assimilation potential, with preference given to people who are culturally similar to the United States. Number three, we need welfare reformation. Minnesota must implement immediate verification measures for all means tester programs, including biometric identification for benefit recipients, cross-program data matching to detect duplicate enrollment, and aggressive asset testing that considers extended family resources for immigrant populations with demonstrated collectivist economic practices. All right. Number four, finally, political accountability. The politicians who enable this disaster through negligence or ideological complicity must face consequences. Congressional hearings should subpoena Minnesota officials to testify under oath about their knowledge of the fraud and their failure to act. The Department of Justice should investigate potential conspiracy or corruption charges against officials who deliberately ignored the evidence of fraud. That is the only way. These are the only measures that are going to ensure that this does not happen again. Looking ahead, this Minnesota catastrophe represents more than just bureaucratic failure or just some random criminal enterprise. It is a direct consequence of abandoning the fundamental principles that made America's immigrant tradition successful. For much of our history, immigration operated under the explicit expectation that newcomers would assimilate to American norms, contribute more than they consumed, and embraced a shared civic identity that superseded ethnic or tribal loyalties. The Somali experiment in Minnesota has violated every single one of these principles. It has imported a population with catastrophic human capital deficits, placed them in a welfare system that incentivizes dependency rather than mobility, and empowered political actors who defend criminality as cultural difference. The result is billions of dollars hole in the public treasury, the corruption of Minnesota's social programs, and the poisoning of intergroup relations for generations. The uncomfortable truth this administration must finally confront is that not all cultures are equal, let alone equally compatible with Western societies, and not all immigrant groups possess equal capacity for successful integration. Somalia, a failed state with clan-based social organization, minimal educational infrastructure, and no tradition of constitutional government, produces immigrants who require decades of intensive investment with minimal returns. At a time of fiscal constraint and social fragmentation, we can no longer afford such experiments in social engineering. The path forward really requires brutal honesty about the abject failure of mass migration, courage to implement unpopular but necessary reforms, and a total and outright rejection of the ideological fantasies that created this disaster in the first place. The alternative is the continued destruction of America's culture, the bankruptcy of our welfare state, and the descent into the very tribal conflicts that refugees supposedly flee. Minnesota has provided the warning. The nation must now find the will to act before this localized catastrophe spreads across the entire nation. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, please like, follow, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.